You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I am a scientist. I am a scientist. I am a scientist. We gotta live on science alone.
Welcome to Unbiased Science, where we bring scientific method to the madness. We're your hosts, Dr. Jessica Steyer
and Dr. Andrea Love.
And this week, we're actually recording a bit of an emergency episode in response to a policy statement that came across our screens shortly before the holidays that we felt really warranted a response. And we're joined by not one, but two experts to speak on this topic comprehensively. So without further ado, let's dig in. Oh, and by the way, Happy New Year. I just realized this is going to air, I believe it's January 3rd.
Our first episode of the new year, and we are not shying away from controversy.
No, we're coming in hot. And you know, of course, happy to have survived 2023, and we have high hopes for 2024. All right. So let me just set the stage super briefly. So what was the date? It was December 11th when we were scrolling social media and we saw that the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, they posted a new policy on GMOs. And I'll just read the one sentence Instagram post that I saw, which is that more research is needed into GMOs' effect on children. Pediatricians can help families think through the cost and health impacts of their food choices. All right. I know we have a lot to say. Let me introduce our two guests and then we'll just get right in. And just a really brief apology if my quality is not as good as usual today. I had hid everything for Christmas. We were hosting and I can't find my camera. I can't find my microphone. So I am so sorry, but we had to make this work. So our first guest is Dr. Kevin Folta. He is a professor in the Horticultural Sciences Department at the University of Florida. He completed a PhD in molecular biology at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and postdoc work at the University of Wisconsin. His research analyzes the molecular and genetic circuits that control flowering time and accumulation of flavors and aromas in fruit crops. Essentially, he's been in the field of molecular biology in the context of plant biology for decades. He was recognized with multiple awards for research in science communication, including the NSF Career Award and the Cast Borlaug Award, I hope I'm saying that correctly, in agricultural communication. He also raises fruits, veggies, eggs, and turkeys with his wife in rural Florida. And he's also the host of the Talking Biotech podcast since 2015 with 430 weekly episodes. Our next guest is Dr. Nicole Keller. Nicole is a general pediatrician who treats kids of all ages in suburban and rural areas of her Midwest home. She's chair of the pediatric department at her medical center, and as such has been involved in actively updating best care practices for her pediatric patients and community. She became a farmer's wife during residency, which is when she first started to be interested in agricultural topics as they crossed paths with medical recommendations. And she is also a member of the AAP. Nicole and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's fun to be on a podcast I like.
Well, we like to hear that. So obviously there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to talk about obviously the science behind genetic engineering technology, the data on food GMOs in particular. Kevin is, an expert on this topic. And I think it's really worth underscoring that, Nicole, you reached out to us because you were so fearful of the consequences of both patient care, public health, and literacy as a member of AAP and as someone who crafted a really eloquent and diplomatic letter to AAP about this paper. And, as we'll talk about, Kevin has reached out to the authors and the editors, and there doesn't seem to be much of an impetus to correct a lot of these glaring omissions and outright falsehoods. Now, we have talked about genetic engineering, GMOs, organic agriculture, myths and misconceptions about all of those topics at length in previous podcast episodes. So we're really going to focus specifically on this statement by the AAP, which ultimately is going to become a publication, a published piece in Pediatrics, which is the journal of the AAP that's going to come out this month, January 2024. And ultimately, it is a gross misrepresentation on the totality of the evidence on what we have with regard to GMOs, foods, pediatric populations, health, and so on.
And we'll link to those past episodes, of course, in our show notes. We'll repost them to our stories. And I also just wanted to mention, we had dozens of people reach out to us in our DMs saying, oh my gosh, do I need to be scared about feeding my kids GMOs? And, even if, let's say they come to their senses and they issue some sort of correction, retraction, whatever it is, a lot of damage has already been done. And I know that we're going to talk about that on this episode. Sorry, Andrea, go on.
No, that's totally fine. It's actually a good segue. So, GMO foods are extensively studied. They have been studied for decades. They are more studied than any other food product that we consume because they fall under the purview of multiple regulatory agencies, including the FDA, the EPA, and the USDA. And unfortunately, misinformation, and we'll talk about some of the rehashing of pieces of misinformation in this piece, but also low science literacy and the appeal to emotion has led to a lot of undue fear about genetic technologies broadly, but GMOs, as well as conventionally grown foods with regard to false claims about pesticides. So, let's dig in. Let's start from aside from the individual false claims and misinformation in the piece, let's talk about the more glaring issues with regard to the actual writing of the piece and the sources, or rather some of the sources that are omitted when you actually read through this article. So Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you first to maybe kick things off.
Yeah, this paper was a real problem because as an editor and a reviewer and an author, and as someone who instructs graduate students in scientific writing, this thing was unacceptable. It was a complete fail. It showed citation bias, only using citations which supported their narrative. They clearly had a thesis that they wanted to find, which is completely the opposite of the way we do science. Anything that didn't agree with their conclusion went inside the review. And just so much out of context in terms of the amounts of pesticide exposure, which drives me crazy, but so many errors and the logical fallacy, just writing everything to emphasize fear, uncertainty, and doubt. That's what this was all about. This was about scaring parents. This was not about talking about the current state of a very well-studied science.
Something that Jess and myself are constantly reiterating is that when you go to PubMed or Google Scholar or any online search database, you can find any article to support an opinion or a personal bias. But as scientists or anyone who should be doing good science if they're writing a scientific article, and unfortunately these three pediatricians were not doing good science or even a good literature review, when you critically appraise the totality of evidence with regard to a topic, you include everything that is relevant. You assess the robustness or the quality of the data. We talk often about how animal studies or Petri studies are much lower on the quality of evidence hierarchy than large-scale human randomized controlled trials. If you look at, clinical case reports, those are obviously also lower. Anything that's observational is lower. And ultimately, they strategically cherry-picked as you mentioned, Kevin, omitted papers that were more recent or more robust to demonstrate that GMOs are in fact safe to consume and are as nutritious, and more broadly, conventional foods are as nutritious. And ultimately, what this is going to do is mislead parents. It's going to mislead clinicians who maybe aren't as well versed with scientific methodology and assessment, and it's misrepresenting the science. And so, Nicole, I want you to maybe talk a little bit about the ethos of healthcare providers, this do no harm, the failures of that, and also what you anticipate are going to be the biggest fallout with regard to your individual clinical practice, but also, health and medical care more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So to me, as a clinician, I'm supposed to be kind of the bridge between the research and the science and bringing that to the public. And so it's my responsibility to know what to really listen to and what to spread, as opposed to what to maybe hold off on or learn a little bit more about before I discuss that with my patients. And when this paper comes out and it's supported by an organization like the AAP, it makes it really hard for me to do that job well, because I have this huge organization saying that they're unsafe when I have learned through years of looking into it myself that these are misinformation, these are false claims. So it is frustrating that there wasn't more responsibility put on that. It's that great power and great responsibility. I think sometimes too, as a doctor, I know a lot about medicine. I know a lot about kids. I can tell you all about that kind of stuff. But what do I really know about agriculture? Even as a farmer's wife who was interested in this topic, I still sought out the information from Dr. Folta and from Dr. Gregory Bond and Dr. Carl Winter. I've talked to all these people. I had chats over the last years about this stuff, trying to really understand the science, because I am a doctor and I'm not an agricultural expert. And that was not taken into account at all here either. And because of this lack of looking more broadly, we're supposed to have a multidisciplinary team and look at all that in medicine. And they didn't. They sought out their opinion and kind of just went with it. And this is going to make everyday clinic a little bit more challenging. I was telling Kevin last week already that last week, just alone, I had a dad tell me, well, I only do organic milk because it's in a carton, no plastic for my kid. Okay, fine. We talked briefly about it, but I just thought, wow, that's a really powerful statement. I've had a child with something we call failure to thrive who wasn't gaining weight. And as we delved into it, it turns out mom wanted to only buy organic food. She couldn't afford it. So she was only breastfeeding her baby and not giving food. And her baby's health was at risk. I get families all the time, a multivitamin. I don't want the added sugars in that. So I'm not going to give the multivitamin, even though it's necessary. Here we've scared people away from things that are appropriate for them and are causing more harm with that fear that is completely unfounded. It's just totally irresponsible.
So you bring up a great point, right? Because this paper, and I hesitate to even call it a review because it's not reviewing the evidence. It's really selecting, statements and actually poorly designed studies to support this, clearly a preconceived opinion by these three pediatricians. And as you noted, there were no other co-authors, there were no molecular biologists, there were no biochemists, there were no chemists, there were no agricultural scientists, there were no engineers on there. They didn't consult any environmental scientists or even registered dietitians or, anything like that. And so, it's interesting because when I was reading the paper, the first thing that struck me was that the talking points were they seemed like they were out of the environmental working group playbook, right? The EWG, which is the activist organization that is largely funded by organic farms, industrial organic farms. And they put out the Dirty Dozen, which scares people away from eating very healthy and nutritious and safe produce items, as well as sunscreens and commercial products and cleaning products and, consumer products for your kids, because they propagate this undue fear of chemicals. And of course, they position it as, well, the conventional items are filled with chemicals and are killing you, and the organic ones are not filled with chemicals and are not killing you. And, aside from the fact that everything is chemicals, you're a sack of chemicals. That's my favorite phrase at the moment. But organic farming, organic agriculture uses pesticides. They're not chemical free. They're not pesticide free. And, we'll get into more of some of the specifics there. But completely separate from the fact, if you look at the body of evidence comparing organic foods to conventionally grown foods, there's no healthfulness difference, there's no nutrient density difference, there's no safety difference. But what is different is that they're at least 2 times more expensive. And so if people are now scared to buy conventional produce and they can't afford organic produce, then what's going to happen is exactly what you said, Nicole, right? They're going to not feed their children produce. And we've actually seen this in action where this is impacting individuals of lower socioeconomic status more substantially for obvious reasons, right? They don't have the privilege and the luxury of just going and buying organic, even if you needed to, which you don't. And what ends up happening is that they're not eating produce, they're not eating frozen vegetables, they're not eating canned vegetables. All of these things are wonderful options. They are perfectly healthy and nutritious. They're full of great nutrients that particularly children need. They're filled with fiber, which is beneficial for pretty much every bodily system in your body. We have a whole episode on fiber. It's good for your gut. It's good for your cardiovascular health. It helps reduce risk of cancers and other related diseases. So it's going to have this major trickle down effect for public health on the whole.
So, Nicole, that's what I was going to say is that, you just hit the nail on the head. The whole statement was dripping with elitism. I could not believe the way that it was phrased. Andrea, you just summarized pretty much everything that I was going to say. Of course, we're on the same wavelength here. But how terrible is it that there are people who are now feeling guilty and shamed away from buying produce altogether because they can't afford the higher price tag of the non-GMO organic, which, as we all understand, is not nutritionally superior or superior in any way.
I completely agree that the elitism and, the AAP aims for equity. And I think that's a fabulous thing to aim for. But gosh, we missed the ball on this one. We are completely throwing people in lower socioeconomic statuses under the bus here. It's unfathomable. And, to me too, we fight a lot in medicine about things like vaccines, right? Vaccine safety and that they're research, the ingredients are safe. People worry about all the ingredients just like they're worried here about GMO ingredients, which is so interesting, the parallels. But we know that they're well researched. We know what the studies say, and we support that. And the AAP does a great job with that. How did they not see here that this is that same problem, that someone's going, oh, it's aluminum in vaccines causing XYZ, and here they're saying it's pesticides and GMOs not letting us be healthy. It's the same argument, and they didn't see through that, and that's really just bewildering to me.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the specific claims that I think are worth using as illustration, Nicole, first from you, I want to, we talked a lot about making your day-to-day more difficult. Let's talk a little bit about when these statements are going to conflict and what that's going to do for, trust and your ability to care for patients, right? So, say you have a patient comes in and they're like, well, I follow all the AAP guidance, right? And they say that I shouldn't be eating conventional produce anymore. And you're like, well, actually the data, don't demonstrate that. And that was, a flawed paper. What's going to happen as a result of this?
Yeah. I only have so many minutes in my clinic visits to address all sorts of things regarding dietary things, safety, vaccines, growth, development, et cetera. And when I have to start focusing all on this, I'm going to also miss out talking on other things because I've had to focus on this that shouldn't be something that I really have to worry about. I should be able to say, oh, no, don't worry. The AAP, everyone, agrees that GMOs are safe and you should just buy whatever produce you can find for it and looks good to you. So that's going to be a day-to-day conversation that's going to change. And again, it's going to make me look like the sole person that's going against the AAP and that I'm the conspiracy person here because this big organization that's supposed to be reliable is giving out this statement. And again, I think the AAP gets a lot of things right. I keep saying vaccines, but I fully support them in that and a lot of their other pushes and support. But I think that's where the responsibility here was so not taken seriously. And it's going to make conversations more challenging. I'm going to have to spend that time. And it's just frustrating. I will say the other thing too, that while in my clinic, this is going to be effective. I think too, I'm part of a bunch of physician groups, on social media and that kind of stuff. And all the time, people are saying, well, I only buy the organic, or should I buy organic milk? Or I've heard that GMOs are unsafe. And I do my best to try to educate and provide sources. And in physician groups, people can't tell the difference. If physicians who are fairly educated, at least on medicine, can't tell the difference, how are we supposed to have the general public be able to tell this apart? It's just frustrating.
And of course, it illustrates the fact that, training between scientists and clinicians, healthcare providers is very different. We're scientists, Jess, myself, Kevin, we're not doing patient care. We're doing, study design, study evaluation, methodology. We're doing the data analysis and the evaluation of the data, so that you, healthcare providers, clinicians, can have the best methods and insight to treat individuals, and so it's going to erode that conduit, but it's also going to erode kind of literacy and trust in science more broadly. So, Kevin, maybe you can comment on this, being someone who's been in the agricultural sciences for many decades and kind of seeing this evolution and really this rejection of many scientific topics that really could advance agriculture and also public health.
Well, that's a huge part of this. I've been studying genetic engineering since I was a little kid. And I grew up with, through the 80s, where I saw these crops starting to be developed, and I saw the releases, and I heard all the promises, and we heard all the great things that were going to happen. And between then and now, I've watched tens of thousands of laboratories, tens of thousands of journal articles talk about, here are the beautiful benefits of something we can do for the environment, something we can do for the food insecure, something we can do for the farmer, something we can do to control food costs. And only a little sliver of those realities has come to fruition, mostly because of tremendous pushback from false information levied by a couple of small organizations. And that has gained the public trust over us. And when you look at something like this, where the AAP or makes a mistake like this, it erodes the trust in what we do as scientists and science communicators who get out there to discuss these things based upon the literature, where they don't. The problem is that I've been, front and center, like in terms of Twitter, Facebook, whatever, wherever there's questions on genetic engineering, I'm glad to try to answer them. I've always been very soft and very try to be helpful. But now the response is, well, teams of physicians say you're wrong. And they'll post this article in the journal in Pediatrics. And that will win the average person over me anytime. Any concerned mom who's curious about what to feed her kid, are they going to listen to the scientist who's been in biotechnology his whole life? Or are they going to listen to a team of scientists at the AA, or a team of physicians at the AAP? And that's a no-brainer. This has been a shot to our public trust in a perfectly good technology that feeds people, and they should be ashamed.
So, and obviously I don't think any of us can speak for the authors, the three pediatricians or the editor or AAP more broadly, but what do you think is kind of the motivation behind this? Is it solely, AAP kind of low biotechnology literacy and not realizing, the outcome? I mean, I feel like this could be anticipated, right? Because this echoes of Andrew Wakefield and the Lancet and his fake data on the MMR vaccine. And you think that we would have learned from, publishing essentially opinion pieces in prestigious journals. But, what do we think's going on here?
I've been following this through the AAP for about 6 years now. And I say 6 years, I've been a member of the AAP for longer, but I'd gone to a conference, their national conference, and there was a talk on food safety and environmental exposures. And I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to go. They're going to put to rest all these fears. People are going to be educated. It's going to be awesome. And during that lecture, they continued to make people fearful of pesticide residues. They talked about the EWG as a good resource. Now, this was back in, I think, 2017. But when I saw that, I mean, my heart sank. And I actually asked the speaker at the end of the lecture, did, the AAP seek out any agricultural inputs? Have we looked into that? And she wasn't totally aware. But since then, I've kind of followed what they've been doing. And I feel like this is an unfortunate trend. They will have these articles or these little blips in a magazine that say, oh, well, yes, if a family is able to buy organic, they should. But if they're not, it's okay, which is also just ridiculous because that's what, you're saying, oh, this might be poison, but if that's all you can afford, that's okay. It's good enough. Like, how contradictory can you get? So while I would love to say this is a one-off, I fear this is a little bit of a trend. I hate saying that someone might have agenda behind this, but it certainly feels this way when you see this repeated offense over and over. I've offered suggestions. I have put evaluations after these lectures, and I've written magazines and said, this is what's inaccurate. And I've never gotten a response back from anybody asking to spread the better science. So, I'm doing my best. But again, when I'm on a social media board with thousands of physicians and I'm the one person saying this isn't accurate, it's really hard for people to want to believe me. And same thing in clinic with patients. I say, oh yeah, follow the AAP on vaccines and safe sleep and all that stuff, but don't follow them.
But don't. That. Yeah, right. It really, it erodes your ability to be a good care provider. And of course, it propagates, just complete misinformation. Aside from, we talk a lot about what's the harm if, a healthcare provider, says, oh, well, it's okay if you put potatoes on your feet because you believe it's going to help your illness. And the harm is belief in one piece of misinformation makes someone more likely to believe in more misinformation. And now you're seeing that snowballed from a large medical organization. So it's very problematic. Yeah.
I hate to guess at someone's intent, but when you get certain fingerprints in a manuscript, you kind of start to see some patterns. And a couple of things were use of inflammatory language, like they bring up 2,4-D. Or Agent Orange, I should say, Agent Orange, which was a combination of chemistries, one of which was co-purifying with something that caused all the problems. It wasn't the herbicide 2,4-D. They talked about glyphosate showing up in meat and milk products, but they didn't say that it hasn't been detected. They just say that it could be a contaminant. Okay, a contaminant. They talk about a paper. They cite one paper that says there's no consensus on the safety of GMO foods, which is a term I absolutely hate. They are ingredients from crops that were genetically engineered. And they're the same exact ingredients as they are in conventional organic food. It's sugar is sugar, oil as well. But they say there's no consensus. The paper was written by people who give talks against genetic engineering, people who write books against genetic engineering. It's written by the same people who have been wrong for 30 years. And yet AAP authors choose to cite that paper over the thousands and thousands of papers that have come out demonstrating safety and efficacy, or even better yet, the lack of papers showing evidence of reproducibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're often, cherry picking or using that one single study that is poorly designed, and they're ignoring the large meta-analyses assessing both epidemiological and biological data from 20 years. So it's definitely an illustration of poor science, poor literature review.
So when the AAP put up that post on Instagram that sort of at least alerted me to what was going on, we commented on it. And we basically said, we're so disappointed, with this statement. And we had multiple people chiming in and saying, are you saying that we shouldn't assess the safety of GMOs and pesticides? Of course, that's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is these things have been studied extensively and continue to be studied. And what the statement does is it plants this seed. It implies that we're not assessing, that we don't have evidence of safety. And that is where I think we're all just like, how could they have put this up in good conscience? It doesn't make any sense.
And I sort of mentioned it before too, but this is right out of the anti-vaccine kind of activism playbook. They say, well, maybe there's a little bit of concern, or maybe we should look more into this. I'm just asking questions. And you're thinking, but there is research on this. You're not just asking questions. You're planting seeds of doubt by saying, ask questions. They even say in the parent accompanying piece that parents should read the research to make sure they know, because other news outlets may want to steer them away or steer them away from the fears of GMOs. And I'm thinking, no, that is our job to read the research and tell you what's important and what to follow. Yet they set up parents that there might be controversy about this. How awful.
It's kind of an array of logical fallacies and also this false balance premise where, 25, 30, 40, at this point, it's past 40 years of data, is is somehow comparable to, this paper that conveniently omitted any assessment of organic pesticide residues,
And your point about more research, one of the lines in the paper says, based on the IARC decision, which maybe we'll talk about glyphosate, suggests that we need to do more research. That was in 2014. Since then, there have been 77,000 papers published on glyphosate between that decision and this AAP review. And none of them have conclusively shown any particular link to cancer, any mechanistic or epidemiological link that's solid. So we'll talk about that maybe later. But it just is, again, it's that selective use of language to create fear and uncertainty.
So I think it's a good opportunity now to kind of dive into some of the specific statements that are, they're all really harmful, but maybe some of the more egregious ones. So, maybe I'll kick things off. So the first thing that they say is that the genetic traits that the seed biotechnology industry has chosen to introduce are limited to herbicide and insect resistance. And the National Academy of Sciences concludes that there are not adequate data to support increase in crop yield as a result of GMO agriculture. So first of all, the source they're using from National Academy of Sciences was a very long, comprehensive paper review from 2016. They actually ignore more recent data and statements from National Academy of Sciences that say the opposite. Specifically, foods made with GMO ingredients do not pose any specific health risks, but of course they're using National Academy of Sciences to give credibility to this argument. Second of all, the fact that they're saying that the food crops are herbicide resistant and insect resistant is false. There are 10 FDA-approved GMO crops currently on the market, including sweet corn, soybean, canola, cotton, sugar beets, potatoes, apples, papaya, summer squash, alfalfa, and then also we could throw in the Aqua Advantage salmon, which is an animal and a non-plant organism. And they're not limited to herbicide and insect resistance. For example, we did a post on papaya. If we didn't genetically engineer papaya to resist the papaya ring spot virus, which essentially wiped out papaya crops in Hawaii in the 80s and 90s, we wouldn't have papaya anymore. So we wouldn't have foods. People who farmed them wouldn't have livelihoods. They wouldn't have incomes. Potatoes, there are a few different GMOs, but the more popular GMOs in potato category, they resist a fungus called late blight, which actually caused the Irish potato famine, if you're familiar with that. Summer squash resists zucchini yellow mosaic virus, which kills a variety of cucurbit crops, including your squashes. And so, first, it's a false statement. Second, even if the GM crops that we had available only were tolerant of herbicides, so what? That means that you can spray fewer herbicides to kill other weeds and yield more crop and feed more people. They say that these traits aren't benefiting people because it's not directly adding nutrition to the food. But here we're talking about things that allow people to grow food, to feed people, to have a livelihood, to help the economy. And the data demonstrate if you don't control for pests, whether it's a pathogen pest or an insect or a weed, you don't have crops. So crop yield is a direct consequence of these things. Kevin, I want to hand it over to you first for some additional comment on this.
Yeah. So a whole bunch of comments on this one. So first of all, we've never engineered a crop for yield. Or it hasn't been approved, right? We could do that. We could have huge yields. We could have higher yields than we do. But again, these are traits that are lost in the mess. And big agricultural companies, they engineer. So the only traits that have been engineered in are the ones that can be grown on massive acreage because of these traits. Of course, the papaya is a small trait, but papaya was an exception because it happened in the 90s. Long story behind papaya. That's awesome. But yield increases go up because of severe pest pressure or weed pressure, where these traits really do shine through. The main role of these traits for insect and herbicide resistance is to save time and money for farmers. It's about using less fuel. It's about less labor. It's about less time, less tilling, less disruption of the ground. You have less soil loss. These are really important attributes that this article doesn't even consider. They basically say there's no benefit to these crops. Farmers wouldn't use them if there was not a benefit. And 90% of farmers are using these for canola, soybeans, corn. And corn and soy, a lot of it goes into animal feed, huge amount. And so the price of beef, price of pork, price of chickens really is tied to the readily available crops that are being grown on these massive acreages. So food security is a big issue and tied to these. And the AAP totally swings and misses.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course, they omit a lot of the additional economic downstream consequences of having these things. And they omit the fact that there could be more GMO crop options if public pressure and often political pressure really didn't halt progress on this. I was talking recently about HB4, which is a new cultivar of wheat that was developed in Argentina, and it has a gene from sunflowers in it that allow it to essentially survive in times of drought. So it turns on or it regulates gene expression so that it can survive, whereas normal wheat would die pretty quickly in drought conditions. And as we look at the expansion and the acceleration of climate change and increased drought conditions, food security, agriculture stability is going to become more dependent on these types of technologies that are going to allow us to grow crops in places where maybe we previously couldn't, or maybe where they used to be able to be grown, but because the climate has changed, now they're under threat from not being able to grow and ultimately provide food to children, right? This is the pediatrics, right?
Just as a quick aside too, one of the authors was also the past chair of the Committee on Environmental Health. So not only is this a nutrition thing, but they're saying that environmentally that GMO or GE technology is not environmentally friendly, but it actually is more friendly than many organic practices that need more land, more resources, more inputs into the land. So this is helping us be more efficient. And someone from the Environmental Health Committee is saying that they're wrong. Just something I had to say.
Yeah, it's a great point. And Kevin, you kind of alluded to this, right? A lot of these genetic modifications in these crops mean that you don't have to till the soil as much. So you have less erosion, less runoff, meaning that anything you do have to spray on the crops is less likely to run off into groundwater. It's less likely to bioaccumulate. And, it means that you can actually maintain the land more healthily. So you're not reduced. We hear a lot about nutrient leaching and over-tilling. That's not happening, right? These are pseudoscience, misinformation, inflammatory statements that are not founded on reality and ultimately are recycled by organizations like EWG. So the next thing really gets into kind of the pesticide crux, because I think the thesis of this is that, conventional pesticides used on GE crops are, we don't know if they're harmful. And of course, conveniently omitting the fact that organic farming uses pesticides, many of which with higher toxicity than any of these pesticides that would be used in conventional farming. So they say an unfortunate consequence of the increasingly heavy use of herbicides late in the growing season on these tolerant crops is that measurable quantities of glyphosate and other herbicides termed residues remain present in GMO grains at harvest. So, Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you for the crux of this. But first, measurable doesn't mean clinically relevant. Measurable and residue mean that trace levels may have been detected using very sensitive chemistry procedures like HPLC, which is a type of chromatography, to look for trace levels. Residue does not mean something is clinically relevant. And this is the same trope that the EWG uses verbatim about the dirty dozen, the pesticide residues. And of course, they're ignoring toxicological risks. And they're also omitting the fact that organic pesticides are also used, and those residues are not nearly as stringently monitored and regulated compared to conventional pesticides. So, Kevin?
Yeah, I should say, I hang out with organic farmers all the time, and we sell at farmers market every Saturday. And I trust what they do, and I trust their use of pesticides to control pests. I mean, perfectly safe in my book, just as are conventional. And I also hang around with analytical chemists. A lot of the work we do is looking for molecules that are almost not there. And I can tell you, if you want to detect a chemical, there is a way to do it. And they can measure glyphosate, and they do measure glyphosate routinely, down into the parts per trillion, which is seconds in 32,000 years. which I love that. Like, how relevant is seconds in 32,000 years? But this is the level at which these wizards can detect this stuff. And as you say, it doesn't mean it's clinically relevant. The best part about this is that they're looking for glyphosate in the urine.
It's a
which is
waste
exactly
product.
where you'd want to find it.
Good, my body's getting rid of it.
Right. You're excreting it like you're supposed to.
They totally ignore giving context to the levels that are being detected, which are in the parts per trillion, parts per billion, low parts per billion. And then in the pharmacology of this, that it doesn't bioaccumulate, it moves rapidly through the body, and some small amounts metabolized by the liver. But in general, this stuff moves right through you. So they're saying, we detect it in so many people, therefore that's a red flag. As you say, measurable amounts, right? You can measure almost none. Detectable, yes, you can detect almost nothing. It doesn't mean that it's harmful, and it doesn't mean it has any physiological or clinical
maybe we should
relevance.
start calling them homeopathic residues because there's barely anything left. How about that?
I love it. And of course, just to remind everyone, glyphosate is obviously conflated with big agriculture, which I kind of hate that phrase because, again, omitting the fact that organic agriculture has big agriculture too. And glyphosate has lower acute toxicity than 94% of other herbicides, including organic ones and other commercial products, and lower chronic toxicity than 90% of those. And that includes vinegar, acetic acid, and table salt. And of course, there is no human evidence that glyphosate in these trace amounts is causing harm to people.
But Andrea, there are lawsuits. What would you say to people who say that?
Well, we know lawsuits are not evidence. They're not scientific evidence. It's often people on a jury are misled by whoever's making the best argument. It's often a public display, a public spectacle, and not necessarily based on reality. But of course, they use that urine paper that Kevin, you talked about, and they say, there's 90 people that are in this study, which is not very strong when you're looking at quality of data. And they say, well, the glyphosate levels were significantly higher, statistically significantly higher amongst the people who, ate conventional versus those who ate organic diets. If you actually look at the finite levels, they're pretty damn close. And conveniently, organic diets are not using glyphosate. They're using organic pesticides. And conveniently, this paper did not measure organic pesticide levels in that urine. So they use that to kind of support this claim that, okay, well, people are peeing out some trace levels of glyphosate, and this presence, these toxic herbicides are the hazard to children's health associated with GMO-based food consumption. And the carcinogenic hazards, they substantially overshadow theoretical risks. And of course, that's 100% false. And they're using the IARC classification, and they strategically select the IARC, which is the International Association for Research into Carcinogenicity, which is a working group of the WHO that assesses hazard, not risk, not actual exposures. And they ignore the food safety experts. So they ignore the European Food Safety Authority. They ignore the FDA. They ignore the JECFA. All of these organizations are literally the experts in food consumption, food ingredients, and food safety. And they're the ones that are looking at actual plausible risk due to exposures. The EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority. So let's ignore the US-based entities because a lot of people are, well, the FDA is just in bed with big ag. So the European Food Safety Authority, though, concluded that glyphosate is unlikely to pose a carcinogenic hazard to humans. And the evidence does not support classification that the IARC assigned it with regard to carcinogenic potential. So the IARC has classified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen, which means that there's limited evidence in humans. There hasn't been a causal relationship assigned. And again, probable means something very different in this classification than what it means in kind of, lay speak. But Kevin, maybe you can comment on, why cherry picking this statement from IARC is doing a disservice to the totality of evidence.
Yeah, that's really important, because the IARC decision when that came out was earth shaking, because this hazard-based assessment, which if you dig into the data, they look at, as you mentioned, toxicity in humans, animals, and cytotoxicity. And they can show in a petri dish, maybe it causes some cells to do weird stuff. When they looked at, I think it was 315 studies, they found just a handful of them that may have shown a little bit of evidence. This decision by IARC was based on scant data and was a hazard-based assessment. When you looked at Health Canada and all the ones you named, they say there's no evidence, zero evidence of carcinogenicity. And the point that I always make is that in the 8 or 9 years since this assessment was made, there still is no evidence, whether it's molecular, whether it's epidemiological. There's been a couple of meta-analyses that if you take a little data from here and a little data from here and you jam them together, maybe you can see a slight association that they say is significant, statistically significant, but not biologically significant. And they also ignore the criticisms of those meta-analyses, which are also published papers that say the meta-analysis is just where you look at all the data sets kind of merged and statistically massage them to give you some sort of outcome, that said that they're comparing apples and oranges, which is true. The work by Zhang et al. In 2019 really looks at data sets that you can't really compare together. And what's really interesting about that work is, well, I won't go into that, but the work here at the AAP conveniently ignores the criticisms of that work, which really show that it was inappropriately combined. So all of the resort to the IARC is used to give the herbicide that can barely be detected a label of a probable carcinogen, which hasn't been substantiated by any of the follow-up and really wasn't, in most people's opinion, a good outcome at the time, a reasonable synthesis.
And Andrea, we sometimes give examples, and I'm blanking right now, on other things that are labeled as probable carcinogen. It's like pickles, things that are...
no, that's in the aspartame, which is possible.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think maybe deli meat. I think deli meat is also in the probable. And again, you're not looking at likelihood of exposure, dosage, route of administration, any of these sorts of things. And the irony is then after this whole, we're gonna subtly suggest that glyphosate causes cancer. Then they're like, they say in the paper verbatim, a major benefit of organic food is that it substantially reduces dietary exposure to pesticides, which is 100% completely false. First of all, organic, I'm going to keep saying it. I'm going to say it until I'm blue in the face. Organic farming uses pesticides. They just use organic pesticides, which are different than the synthetic or conventional pesticides. They include things like copper sulfate, which actually does bioaccumulate and has quite high toxicity. And, it plays on that appeal to nature fallacy. Well, the organic pesticides, they're natural, therefore they're better. That's blatantly false. The origin of a pesticide does not dictate its toxicity. Organic pesticides are no more safer or better for the environment or better for the farmers. We hear that a lot. Well, it's not the glyphosate that's on the food. It's the farmers that are spraying, they're dousing the fields in it. And we've said repeatedly that the amount of glyphosate used is minuscule on a field, because why is someone going to waste money on a pesticide when they only need to use a small amount? They're not dousing anything in it. And we know the decades of data demonstrate that organic food is no more nutritious, no safer, no better for the environment. In some cases, it's worse for the environment. They still use pesticides. And what you're doing is using this appeal to nature fallacy to scare people away from consuming produce. I don't care whether it's organic or conventional. Produce is healthy, nutritious, should be the main component of your diet. And what you're doing is now you're demonizing conventional produce.
Well, and I think too, again, kind of bringing it back to like we're doctors and we work in clinical practice. I prescribe an antibiotic at a certain dose and I do it for a certain amount of time. And farmers do the same with their chemical use. It costs them money and side effects if they overuse it. So no one wants to do that. They don't want to harm their own health, their own kids' health. I mean, we go out to our field and take corn right off the stalk. I have no problem doing that. I would not do that if I thought we were using unsafe levels of this, but that's why there's prescriptions and doses, and you do it so you don't get antibiotic-associated diarrhea in the clinic, and you do it appropriately in the field so you can control weeds, but not have cost of chemical and land usage and soil erosion and all these other things. So it's the same argument. How did we miss that?
Kevin, do you want to comment on kind of the dichotomy or the disconnect between the organic pesticides and the conventional pesticides here?
Well, it's really funny because organic pesticides are just natural poisons. And years ago, they could even use rotenone, which is like
so
horribly
bad, right?
toxic
I
to
know.
fish. It may be still allowable. It still may be allowable in some places. But, we use organic pesticides. We use copper sulfate. We use dipel, which is BT, which is the same protein, which is installed in the crop with a genetically engineered crop, which is awesome because instead of having to apply it and have it get washed off, cost tons of money for dipel, the plant makes its own protection. And we could be putting this thing in the broccoli and cauliflower where we have cabbage loopers, or in the cucurbits where we get pickle worms and all the problems that we have to apply the dipel. It sure would be nice to have plants that made their own. So it's one of these things that when I put on my farmer assistant hat, my wife does all the farming, I would wish that we had these tools to use. It would be awesome if we did, but we don't. And so you have to be very careful when you look at these questions. I know that you mentioned before that they don't test for the organic ones with the EWG, but the EWG will say we detected 52 pesticides on a strawberry, right? And so a family says, okay, well, we don't want strawberries now. I work with strawberry farmers. We might apply 1 or 2 per season. But if you look at the totality of USDA data over the entire country, maybe there are 52 different ones that are applied different times a year.
Total, right.
So
and then you just add it all together.
They add it all together and frame it as, look what they're doing to poison your kids. It is so irresponsible and it hurts the farmer.
And they also omit the fact that even if they detected all these things over the course of a year on a field or, on a plant, all of those levels are orders of magnitude below the thresholds that are set by the regulatory agencies for these levels of pesticides. Again, pesticides are just chemicals, like everything is a chemical. And those levels, those thresholds are really conservative because it's a threshold that is going to essentially eliminate any health risk for any group of people, including those that may have, metabolic issues or things that may make them at increased risk for potential adverse events, right? So they're over exaggerating.
The AAP actually has mentioned that too, that they feel as though that these residue tolerance levels are not set at a point that are safe for children who are growing and developing. They're also not safe for fetuses and pregnant people. And while I appreciate, again, their concern that kids are growing and developing rapidly, they have never even looked to see that the tolerances are tens, if not hundreds of times below a level that would cause harm. And when they do claim that that is happening, they say, well, it's not actually being followed. Even though that level is set by the EPA, they say it's not actually being followed. So they're just kind of making it up now. They're just throwing out things that don't agree. And it's really interesting because, Kevin, I love the way you put it, because when you're talking about anything that the word ends in "cidal," right? That means to kill, right? And, people get this, they get really hung up on this appeal to nature fallacy. And we're like, lots of things in nature can kill you at very low exposures. Look at ricin, look at rosary peas, and you know what? You know why the plants make those things? So that things don't eat them, because they're trying to protect themselves. So we're extracting those same things that they're making that are killing things trying to eat them. And the major difference with conventional pesticides is that we can tweak them a little bit to make them biodegrade faster, or make them more pure, or reduce the likelihood that they'll kill non-target species. So, there's several organic insecticides that, they're intended to kill aphids, but they also kill the predators of aphids like lady beetles. And so, you're killing the pest, but you're also killing the thing that naturally would kill the pest to begin with. So you're not really helping the situation.
But people would rather use that than a synthetic one that has been altered so it doesn't target the lady beetle. It's just obviously I think it really goes to how effective these fear-based marketing campaigns are, and generally, the lack of knowledge on kind of chemistry and the appeal to nature fallacy here.
What people want is they don't want to see a non-zero number, right? That they want zero risk, and that doesn't happen
with anything.
That driving the car, it doesn't with anything. And so a part per trillion is 1 part per trillion too many for most moms who are feeding their kids. And I understand that. I'm a parent of an 8-month-old, and she's awesome. And I wouldn't want to expose her to anything. But I have a handle on what a part per trillion is. And yet that language has a significant risk to parents. And so when AAP endorses it, it really
you
digs.
just hit the nail on exactly what I wanted to say, which is, how did this happen? How did this national trusted medical organization get it so wrong? And how do we, I don't know, for me now it calls into question everything that they say. How do we navigate trusting this organization and other organizations? Because we always say, Andrea and I always say, you have to trust the scientific consensus. And that often means turning to these organizations that one would hope is really assessing the totality of data and evidence on a particular topic. So I don't know, Nicole, can you maybe comment, how do you, as a pediatrician, as a member of AAP, how do you plan to navigate this moving forward?
Yeah, well, I do think this is going to be a little bit of an impetus for me to maybe get out there a little more and maybe try to do more work myself and hopefully create a ripple effect, try to educate as many people as I can. But it's going to be tough. It's just one of those things that I think we're going to have to do day by day and person by person and kind of show people that it's going to be okay, and that the AAP is an organization that is fallible. We're all fallible. We make mistakes. There are realities versus recommendations. And I'll tell parents about that a lot of times in clinic when they say, I just don't really think I can make whatever recommendation we're talking about happening. And I'll say, okay, this is the reality of what you're dealing with your infant at home, and this is the recommendation. Let's find a way that we can maybe come to the middle ground a little bit. And I think this is where the reality of the situation and the recommendation don't jive. And I'm hoping over time they can, I don't know if make amends is the appropriate thing, but make future statements that can help us realize that they know that they can be wrong and that it's okay to be wrong, but the important thing is to fix it and to be responsible about it in the future and learn from it.
That's so important. I think this was, obviously we could talk about this for hours, but obviously, we have to wrap. But Kevin, any last thoughts, about kind of that same question? And then, for both of you, I think before we wrap, what can people do, when they come across this type of misinformation, when they listen to this episode or watch this episode, what can the everyday person do, or what can scientists do, or what can other pediatricians or clinicians do to help mediate some of the anticipated harms that this is going to have?
Yeah, I love this. This is what I always talk about in my action step. You have roles on 2 levels. You can create content and you can amplify the good content of others. And so what I plan to do is write a review of the review for pediatrics. And I've already started this thing. I got going on it. I'm going to put it on a preprint server so everyone can see it. And if AAP decides to publish it, great. If they don't, we'll send it somewhere else. But this needs to be a response needs to be in a visible place. The other things I'll do is a podcast like this. I'm doing lots of writing and discussing on the subject. Nicole and I had a conversation that's available on YouTube. You can check out if you'd like to see a slightly different take. Yeah, that's also linked in the show notes. But so create content, talk about the AAP mistake, but don't do it in a way that criticizes AAP for a bad show as much as they are so important and so influential that we need to hold their hand to get it right. And that with that kind of attitude, we're not doing an us versus them. We're on their side. We need them to be strong. We need them to be effective. And with that kind of ethos, it's much more penetrant that people will believe what we say. The other side of this is amplification. It means that share this podcast, share the writing that's done around this, share the other syntheses, the tweets, the Facebook, share. That AAP article will reach millions of important, influential people. It'll misinform many people. There are a lot more of us than there are of them. And we just need to amplify the good work that's done by others. So important.
Yeah, so true. And of course, if anyone listening to this is a journalist, reporter, media outlet, anyone who thinks that they can help amplify or want to speak with kind of the body of experts with regard to these topics, you know how to find us. We will obviously link to how to find Nicole and Kevin. These are very important conversations. And as Kevin, so eloquently said, it's not about, us versus them. It's not about we're right, they're wrong. It's about helping science literacy, improving public health, improving health outcomes, and alleviating completely unsubstantiated fear. People don't need to, there's enough things to worry about in the world. People do not need to worry about these sorts of things. And it just adds to anxiety and stress, and it gets compounded as social media, propagates misinformation.
And maybe, Andrea, just one final thing is, we often talk about the risk perception gap, and it's people focusing and obsessing over this, which, we've done a point-by-point takedown of why you shouldn't be concerned about GE technology and all that. And we're not focusing on the much more important issues. And we touched on some here, but, just eating your veggies, your fruits, getting the produce in your diet. We're focusing on the wrong things, and we're placing unnecessary weight on something that really poses such, no risk. There's no evidence of risk. And anyway, it's just, this is such an important topic, and I think it gets at a much larger issue.
This affects us all. So
yes.
We need to have the message be that you should choose whatever produce looks good to you. If you like organic, if you want conventional, both types of farmers and farming methods can be safe and use chemicals safely because they're prescribed amounts when they're being used. So buy what you can find, what you can afford, what looks good to you. Just eat more produce.
Exactly. Andrea, you want to take us home?
Thank you, Nicole and Kevin, for joining us for this very important topic. Really, really excited that this is kicking off the new year. We've got big plans for 2024, and it's all going to come back to improving science literacy and public health. So thank you again for joining us. To our listeners, thanks for joining. We hope you learned a thing or two. And if you want to support our efforts and help us grow the impact and reach, please consider sending us a donation. You can find that on our website. You can also pick up a snarky piece of merch like relevant to today's episode, you are a sack of chemicals t-shirt. I'm going to rock mine. That's all on our website, which is www.unbiasedscipod.com. And you can sign up for our Substack, which includes periodic newsletters and offers a way to support us through subscription. That's theunbiasedscipod.substack.com. And of course, make sure to share credible science. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or our social channels or both. Our handle on all of them is @UnbiasedSciPod. Catch you next time on the pod, your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.